Got 100 Steps to Go. Tonight I'll Make It 99 by rayrae118. Chapter 6. When Harry and Ginny returned to McGonagall Castle, Neville was waiting for them in the library. He had gotten out some school books and was working on their Transfiguration summer homework, but eagerly put it aside when the couple arrived. "Everything all right?" he asked, taking note of their expressions. They looked furious, but were trying hard to hide it. Harry took a deep breath and forced himself to relax.
Yeah, it's just been a long day, and it's only noon. Sharptooth says the council approved of the request to make a forgery of Gryffindor's sword. He'll let us know when it's done.
Neville nodded. "That's good. In the meantime..." He held out the pouch containing Hufflepuff's cup. "Here's this. I know you have a safe place for these." Harry took the box.
Thanks, Nev. You want something to eat? Then I might join you. Aunt Minerva would kill me if she learned that I haven't started the Transfiguration homework yet.
Ginny chuckled, and the trio made their way down to the kitchen. Over lunch, Neville told them that he was still looking over for information on the Gaunt family to see if they could narrow down a location on the shack. They were all frustrated that they had only been out searching once, but understood why Sirius and Minerva were being cautious. Besides, it wasn't very productive to just go out and scour the countryside on the off chance they would stumble across the right location. By the time Neville and Ginny had to go home for supper, the two soon-to-be 7th years had finished their Transfiguration work and had made a decent start on potions. The last subject Harry had to complete for his summer homework, and the second to last for Neville, who still needed to finish his charms work. All in all, despite the emotional roller coaster he had been on that morning, Harry felt like it had been a very productive day. As August continued to pass, Harry was struck by the realization that this was the last time he was set his schedule by the departure of the Hogwarts Express. Was this really his last year of school? Yes, Ginny answered in his thoughts, glancing up from the book she had been reading.
Harry looked over and rolled his eyes. It was rhetorical, Gin.
Ginny smacked. "I know. I just thought I'd answer anyway."
Harry sighed. It just seems so surreal. I remember my first trip on the Express. I was terrified. And now I'm on the Quidditch team, head boy, more friends than I ever had before Hogwarts, and the most amazing wife ever.
Ginny beamed and leaned over to give him a kiss. "You're pretty amazing too, Harry. And I sort of know how you feel. My 7th year is going to be so lonely. Why did I have to make friends with so many people older than me?" Harry pulled her into his side.
We'll still be there. We'll visit every Hogsmeade weekend, and you'll see us at the holidays.
"I know," Ginny replied, "but it won't be the same." Harry didn't say anything, because he knew she was right. The next few days saw even more Death Eater attacks, though thankfully the listening device that Snape had finally managed to plant in the Malfoy Manor dining room had given them enough warning, so they were able to avoid any casualties. The device had been working well for the past couple of weeks, since it had been planted, and they had managed to thwart several of Voldemort's plans. Unfortunately, Snape had informed them that the Dark Lord was becoming suspicious, so they needed to use caution. It wasn't what any of them wanted to hear, but they would rather be safe than sorry. 1 week before the end of August, Harry and Ginny went to St. Mungo's. They had set time with Healer Winsby, who had promised to have Frank and Alice Longbottom moved to a private room, so that no one else could interrupt. They met with Augusta a few minutes later, and shortly after that Winsby arrived and led them up to the 4th floor. "It is a pleasure to finally see you in person, Mr. Potter, Miss Weasley. Madame Longbottom. I have seen you around the Janus Thinkley ward before, though I do not believe we have ever met." Augusta inclined her head, but did not speak. Winsby smiled. "I must confess that I am extremely excited for what you are attempting to accomplish." Harry nodded, his own smile rather nervous.
"Thank you for all the help you've given me."
Winsby didn't reply as they reached the correct room. She opened the door slowly. "Madame Longbottom, Perhaps we should go for a cup of tea and let these two work. Augusta didn't seem to want to leave her son and daughter-in-law, but nevertheless followed the healer out of the room. Once they were alone, Harry moved forward until he was in between the two beds. Alice turned her head slowly and peered at them uncomprehendingly.
Harry took a deep breath. Alice seems more aware, so let's start with her.
Ginny nodded her agreement, stepping up to Harry's side and taking his hand.
Just focus on my mind, Harry said. I'll guide you in.
Ginny nodded mentally and focused. Using legilimency, Harry entered Alice's mind, pulling Ginny along with him. He winced as he got his first glimpse of the chaos the Cruciatus curse had left behind. There seemed to be no organisation at all, but Harry forced himself to pass by all of this, going deeper. His practice at navigating his friends' minds came in handy, and he wound further and further his way in. Frowning, Harry stopped in front of what appeared to be a locked door, deep in Alice's mental landscape. Ginny's mental voice sounded uncertain. What's behind that? Harry knew that there was only one way to find out, so he moved towards the door. It had looked to be locked, but the moment he touched the door, he was suddenly on the other side. If Harry had been in corporeal form, he would have taken a step back in surprise. There was what appeared to be a young woman curled up in a far corner. It looked like she was crying.
Hello?
Harry spoke, unsure if he even could talk in someone else's mind. The woman looked up suddenly, her wide eyes full of fear as she looked around the room. Who's there? Harry pushed himself and Ginny closer.
My name is Harry. I'm here to help.
The woman, whom he now knew to be Alice, she looked so much like the Alice in the photos he had from 2 decades ago, then the woman who was lying on his bed at St. Mungo's, if not quite a bit thinner and more ragged, continued to look around. Where are you? He knew he couldn't make a physical form appear, but he wanted to put her at ease.
I entered your mind using legilimency. You were tortured with the Cruciatus curse nearly 16 years ago. I'm hoping that, together, we can bring you back.
Alice frowned. I remember. Was it really 16 years ago? I can't leave this room. Harry tried to make his mental voice comforting and reassuring.
You can. We're here to help.
We? Alice latched onto the word. Harry felt Ginny's presence move closer. My name is Ginny, she said softly. Harry brought me with him, because we think that together we can help you and Frank. Alice suddenly looked anxious. Frank? Neville? Augusta? Are they all right?
Neville and Augusta are fine, Harry placated her, and after we help you, we're going to help Frank.
Alice relaxed slightly. Neville is fine. It sounded like she was reassuring herself rather than asking anyone else. Harry still answered.
He's one of my best friends, but you can see him yourself if you come with us.
Alice looked fearful again. I can't leave, she cried. The door won't open. Harry imagined himself reaching out a hand.
It will, he promised. Just come with us.
Alice hesitated for a moment, and then, tentatively, stood up shakily. She almost fell over, but caught herself. Walking forward, she stopped in front of where Harry's mental presence was, quote-unquote, standing. I'm ready, she said determinedly, a hint of steel in her voice that reminded Harry of the young woman he imagined she used to be. A woman who had gone through aura training, who had fought ferociously in the last war. Harry grasped her hand with his own mental one, and Ginny did the same on the other side. Together they stepped through the door. When Alice looked back, the door was melting into the wall, until it was just a smooth surface once more. The trio made their way through the chaos of Alice's mind. In their wake, order began to restore itself, until they reached a point where Harry and Ginny had entered.
This is it, Harry said softly.
Alice smiled. Thank you, she replied, as Harry and Ginny left her mind. Coming back to himself, Harry waited for some sort of sign that it had worked. Alice was still laying there, her expression blank. Just as he was about to slump in disappointment, Alice blinked and her gaze focused. She sat up and turned to look at the two teenagers. "Harry?" she asked, tilting her head to the side. "Ginny?" Harry smiled widely, and Ginny's grip on his hand tightened.
"It is so nice to meet you, Mrs. Longbottom."
Alice frowned. "How?" Ginny shook her head. "We'll explain later, but for now we should heal Frank." Alice looked over at her husband, and her eyes watered. "Frank," she murmured. Glancing back at Harry, her eyes widened. "You said the attack was 16 years ago. Neville, you said you were friends?" Harry nodded, still smiling.
"He is a great friend. You will be so proud of him. But there will be time for that later. Just rest now. We need to focus. So please, don't worry. We'll help Frank."
Alice nodded slowly, but lay back on the bed and watched as they stared at her husband, their expressions becoming blank and unseeing. She watched them intently for over 20 minutes, before they suddenly seemed to stumble back into their bodies, taking 2 steps backwards. They hadn't done that for her, had they? She wondered curiously. Perhaps it had been harder to bring Frank back. She didn't have time to think further, because Frank sat up, looking around the room, and then launched himself at her. "Alice!" he cried. Harry and Ginny were hard-pressed to stop their tears of joy as the couple reunited, holding each other for the first time in nearly 16 years. After a few minutes, Frank detached himself from his wife.
"Thank you,"
he breathed, his eyes wide as he looked at Harry and Ginny.
"I don't know how you managed it, but thank you for giving us our lives back."
Harry smiled.
"It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Longbottom."
Frank shook his head.
"Please, you're James and Lily's boy. It's Frank and Alice. No formalities."
Alice gasped. He had said his name was Harry, and he did look remarkably like James, but she hadn't realised. She looked at her husband. "Truly?" Frank glanced over at her and nodded slightly. He had been sceptical of the intrusive presence in his mind, and had demanded to know just whom it was who was invading his conscience. He had not expected it to be the 17-year-old version of the child he had last seen as a 1-year-old struggling to escape his mother's arms. Harry nodded and smiled softly at the couple.
"Well then, Frank, I'm honoured to meet you. Your son is one of my best friends, and I'm glad I could do this for him and for you."
Alice's eyes grew sad. "I remember hearing of the attack on your parents. We were still in hiding at that point. I'm so sorry for your loss, Harry." Harry bit his lip.
"Thank you."
He glanced at Ginny.
"Can you get Healer Winsby?"
Ginny nodded and gave Harry a kiss on the cheek before leaving the room. Harry took a chair from the corner of the room and pulled it up to their beds. Both adults were watching him with knowing looks. Harry blushed.
"Ginny's my girlfriend."
Alice nodded. "A Weasley if ever I saw one. Molly's girl? I seem to remember she had had another child before." She trailed off, and Frank grasped her hand. A few moments later, Healer Winsby entered the room, alone. "Miss Weasley is staying outside with Madame Longbottom," she informed Harry. "I just wanted to take a few minutes to perform an examination." Frank looked up, eager.
"My mother is here?"
Healer Winsby nodded and smiled. "She is right outside. I just want to do a basic examination, to make sure everything's working the way it should. You two were out of it for a while." Alice nodded despondently. 16 years, she moaned. "I missed so much of my boy's life." Frank just kept holding her hand.
"But we've got so much more to experience now,"
he reassured her.
"Think of all the things we'll be there for, because of Harry and Ginny."
Alice nodded again, this time happier. "True," she agreed, and then let Healer Winsby perform her tests. The healer asked a series of questions and performed several magical scans, before turning to Harry, smiling widely. "I'm astounded," she informed him. "You may have just changed the entire field. No one has seriously considered using legitimacy in this way before." She put their wand away. "Why don't you bring Madame Longbottom in?" Harry went to the door and opened it, ushering the elderly woman inside. Ginny followed behind her and closed the door. Augusta gasped when Frank turned his clear gaze towards her. "Mom?" he whispered, his eyes filling with tears. Augusta started crying, overwhelmed with emotion at seeing her son look at her and actually recognize her. She barely registered Winsby leaving as she rushed forwards to grasp Frank in a tight hug. "Oh, my boy!" she murmured, the tears leaking freely from her eyes. When Harry had come to her with this idea, she had told him not to tell Neville, because she didn't want him to get his hopes up, but that didn't mean that she wouldn't. She had been terrified that she would begin to believe that this would work, and then be let down when it didn't happen. But standing there, holding her son, a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It was unbelievable. It was incomprehensible. And yet, it was true. Harry and Ginny had done it. After several minutes, Augusta forced herself to let her son go, so that she could hug her daughter-in-law. Alice was openly crying as Augusta embraced her. She had always felt, before the attack, that the woman didn't quite approve of her, or didn't think she was good enough for Frank. But the elderly matron holding on to her was 100% relieved to have her back. "Oh, I cannot believe this," Augusta sniffed, pulling back and looking from Alice to Frank. "In all my years, I never thought." She turned to Harry and Ginny, who were watching with smiles on their faces. "Thank you so much, Harry. This is... She seemed unable to finish her sentences anymore, but Harry understood completely. He wished more than anything to have the chance to hug his parents once more. Harry gave them a few more minutes to greet each other, before he and Ginny drew up enough chairs for all of them, and, together with Augusta, spent the next half an hour bringing the Longbottoms up to speed with the current events as they stood. Frank shook his head when they were all done. "I know Albus is hailed as the new Merlin, but how could he get away with all of that?" He sighed, not really expecting an answer. "I am glad you're all right, Harry. I remember Lily telling us about her sister. She was so upset that Petunia refused to acknowledge her." Alice nodded sadly. "It devastated her. She used to cry every time a letter she sent to Petunia came back unopened." Harry shrugged. "I've made my peace with what happened with my relatives. They're out of my life, and I never have to see them again. I'm much happier with the family I have now." Alice smiled. "I'm glad of that." She bit her lip, looking down into her lap briefly. "I don't know if anyone told you that I'm your godmother, Harry." Harry nodded quickly. "Aunt Minerva told me at the end of my 3rd year, and Neville has given me lots of pictures of you and my parents. I know that you and my mom were best friends, practically since the beginning." He looked at Frank. "Sirius said that you were great at helping him and my dad out with schoolwork, and in aura training." Frank smiled. "Those two never seemed to take anything seriously. And yet they were two of the best fighters I had ever seen. I guess it's no surprise, seeing as how they were raised, even if it was only for a short time in Sirius's case, by Charles Potter. That man could take on a dozen Death Eaters by himself and come out on top. From what I heard when I was in training. I was only fortunate enough to meet him once, at the start of my aura training. By the time I finished training and entered the Corps full-time, he had already been killed in a Death Eater raid." Harry looked down, thinking about the grandfather he had never met. Frank seemed to realise what was going on, and reached out, resting a hand on Harry's shoulder. "He was a great man, Harry. I'm sorry for your loss, but I'm sure you do him proud just by being you." Harry looked at his friend's father and nodded. "I know. I just hate there are so many people in my family that I will never get a chance to know." Healer Winsby knocked briefly and then came in. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. and Mrs. Longbottom should be getting some rest." Augusta nodded and stood up.
Of course. Do you have any idea how long they will need to remain at the hospital? She asked, hope leaching into her voice.
Winsby tilted her head to the side, considering.
We will need to do a few more tests,
officially, but I believe not much more than a week or so. Alice's eyes were overly bright.
Does that mean we may actually be able to see our boy off to Hogwarts?
Winsby bit her lip.
I don't want to promise anything, but assuming you are physically and mentally sound, I don't see why you shouldn't be able to leave by the 31st.
Alice started crying again. The thought of being able to see her son off to school at least once was overwhelming. Frank reached out across the small space between their beds and clasped her hand, understanding completely. Harry and Ginny said their goodbyes quickly and left, wanting to give Augusta some time alone. Outside, Winsby once more congratulated them on their success. Harry glanced around the somewhat busy hallway.
Healer Winsby, we'd really appreciate it if you didn't tell anyone our part in this. We're just happy that the Longbottoms are alright, but we don't want people asking questions about how we did it.
He looked down.
And I really don't need another reason for people to pay attention to me.
Winsby frowned, but agreed to their request, as Augusta left the room.
They're asleep,
she informed them. Harry smiled his thanks before Augusta asked about what tests still needed to be carried out. Winsby sighed. I'm not worried about anything major, she assured the Dowager. The main concern is physical strength at this point. With spells, we were able to keep the muscles from atrophying, and we can minimize potential damage. However, they have still been bedridden for nearly 16 years. We need to make sure they are physically fit and able to move under their own power before we can think about releasing them. Augusta nodded.
I understand, she replied, and my thanks for everything you have done for my son and daughter-in-law.
Winsby smiled and gave them a last farewell, before the trio left the hospital. At the exit, Augusta thanked them yet again, hugging Harry with a strength the teenager hadn't known the elderly woman possessed. Augusta pulled back.
I think it might make a nice surprise for Neville. Don't you agree?
There was a twinkle in her eye that Harry could relate to, as a son and godson of Marauders. He nodded.
Perhaps we should keep it a surprise, then, until they are released.
Augusta nodded.
A farewell party for all of you, then, before the train leaves? Do you think you can add their names to the access list for the flu without anyone the wiser?
Harry smiled.
As our Minerva's heir, I have that authority. I'll make sure they're able to get to the castle. Neville's going to be so shocked. Augusta beamed. You have done so much for the Longbottom family, Harry. We cannot ever hope to repay you.
He shook his head.
We are allies, Augusta. We are friends. I don't do any of this because I am expecting to be repaid. I did this because I know how Neville felt. I would give anything to have my parents back. I couldn't make that happen, but I could do something about Neville's situation.
Augusta nodded.
Understood. But the Longbottom shall forever be in your debt, no matter what you say.
She then left, and Ginny grasped Harry in a tight hug. I can't believe we actually did it. Her mental voice sounded breathless. Harry nodded slightly.
I know. I think I could use this memory to power up Patronus for a week. Remember the look in their eyes when they recognized their surroundings?
Ginny smiled widely. It was amazing, she agreed. It felt so good to help them. He pulled back and grasped her hand.
Come on, he said aloud. I'll take you home.
Harry had passed his apparition test just 2 weeks earlier, so he was now legally able to use that mode of transportation. After taking Ginny back to the Burrow, he returned to McGonagall Castle, feeling completely content. The war was still on, but for right now, he had done a good thing, and his friend's life was about to get so much better. Neville was confused. Harry and Ginny had returned from some sort of outing the day before, looking incredibly excited, though they had definitely tried hard to hide it. His Gran had come home that same evening, looking equally happy, but she deflected any questions about what had happened. Then, the next morning, she had told him that she had some kind of business she had to take care of, and asked if he could stay with Harry and Professor McGonagall for a few days. She wasn't sure how long he would need to stay, though she did promise to be there to see him off on September 1st. When he asked Professor McGonagall, she hadn't had any more answers beyond saying Augusta had asked her for a favour, and she had agreed. Harry and Ginny seemed to be the only ones who knew what was going on, and they weren't talking. Still, Neville trusted them, and he knew they probably had a good reason for keeping them quiet, so he just packed his school trunk and headed over to McGonagall Castle for the rest of the week. His Gran had intimated that he may need to spend the rest of the summer there, and he wanted to have all these things ready. The afternoon of August 30th saw the large group gathered around on the lawn and patio of McGonagall Castle, celebrating the end of summer before the students returned to school in a couple of days. They were also celebrating the last send-off for so many of the teenagers, and the appointments that had been made within the group. Harry and Susan to head boy and girl, Neville to take Harry's place as prefect, and Ron to take over as Quidditch captain. Molly had got Ron a present for his new appointment, and knew that somewhat steep price had been worth it when she watched her son's face light up upon opening the package to reveal the brand new Clean Sweeper leathern broomstick. He launched himself at his mother, grasping her in a tight hug, whispering "Thank yous" over and over again. Molly patted his back, and Ron went to go examine the broom with his friends, while his parents watched, smiling broadly. "Oh, Arthur, can you believe it's their last year?" Molly asked, sniffling tearfully. Arthur shook his head. "I still remember seeing Ron off for the first time. Do you remember the first letter he sent home?" Molly chuckled. He was so excited to be rooming with the Harry Potter. But in the same letter, he said that Harry was even better than the person in the stories claimed. He was relieved to have made his first friend before he even arrived at school. "And the incident with the troll? That was the first time Hermione's name came into it," Arthur commented idly. Minerva winced at the reminder of the troll, as the rest of the adults gathered to talk and reminisce, while the teenagers decided to give Ron's broom a proper initiation, and were currently heading up to the pitch to set up the game. "You had to bring that up?" she asked, sighing and shaking her head. Arthur shrugged. "Sorry." Cyrus Greengrass settled in his seat, his eyes fixed on the teenagers out on the pitch. "It would appear that more happened in the early years at the school than I was aware." Minerva pursed her lips. "Too many incidents. And though Albus has certainly had his share of the blame for the way things played out, Harry is just too inquisitive for his own good." Sirius smirked. "At least he gets it honestly. You remember what James was like?" Minerva shuddered. "A dog with a bone," she agreed ruefully, then glared at Sirius when he opened his mouth, no doubt to make a joke related to his animagus form. Cowed, Sirius closed his mouth, and Minerva smirked slightly. "I am just thankful he did not have the same propensity for pranks as his father. Can you imagine what could have happened at the school if went the Weasley twins and the son of a marauder in residence?" She looked slightly ill, while the rest chuckled, or in Sirius, Remus, and Tonks's case, outright laughed. Sobering, Amelia immediately glanced at the teenagers as well. "It does feel a little surreal," she admitted. "It seems like just yesterday I was putting her on the train at 11 years old. And now, what happened to the last 6 years? I don't remember getting older. When did they?" The rest of the adults agreed wholeheartedly, settling back to watch the teenagers in silence. It was only a short while later when Amelia turned to Minerva. "Where's Augusta? I thought she said she would be here today." Minerva shrugged with one shoulder. "She said she had some business to take care of. Neville has been staying with us for the past week. I am uncertain as to what exactly she is doing, but she did promise to be here. You are right." As if in answer to that query, Augusta chose that moment to appear. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said, sweeping out onto the patio, with an expression of almost anticipation on her face. Minerva stood up. "Augusta, welcome. I trust everything is well with you?" Augusta nodded immediately. "Would you be able to get the children back here? I have something I would like to show Neville." Minerva nodded and glanced at Sirius, who immediately went to the pitch to gather the teenagers. While they waited, Augusta refused to answer any questions the adults posed her. 5 minutes later, everyone was gathered together, and Augusta turned to Neville.
Neville, I know you have been wondering what I have been doing this week. Something happened, and I wanted to have a few days to make sure everything was well, and take care of a few last-minute details before I told you.
Neville frowned. What's going on, Gran? Augusta glanced at Harry and Ginny, who were both smiling widely. Harry looked at his friends as well and said, You two were in on this, whatever this is? Harry nodded.
Don't worry, Nev. It's a good thing. I promise.
Neville looked back at Augusta. So, what is it? He asked, getting frustrated with a lack of answers. Instead of responding, Augusta just turned to the glass doors leading into the house. Everyone followed her lead, and then stared, dumbstruck, as a healthy Frank and Alice Longbottom walked out onto the patio. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed this one. Oh, I love the nice cliffhangers. Yes, that was so lovely. But I will not dally any longer because we've got the next one to do and I have to record that. So I'll see you guys next chapter for all the nice reunions. Bye!